Israel has begun notifying African immigrants that they must leave the occupied territories or face jail. They've already started the implementation of a plan to deport nearly 38,000 immigrants who had entered the occupied territories, mainly Eritreans and Sudanese. Israeli officials started issuing deportation notices to the refugees, saying they had 60 days to leave Israel voluntarily.
Up to 20,000 African refugees who agreed to leave will get a plane ticket and $3,500. However, the grant for those who refuse will be reduced and enforcement measures taken against them and anyone employing them. Unlike European countries, Israel shares a land border with Africa. Many immigrants attempting to reach Israel face brutal encounters with traffickers and Egyptian security forces as they cross the Sinai. Now, as Israel prepares to send them back to Africa, the country faces challenging questions about the meaning and purpose of the Jewish state, itself created as a harbour for Jews fleeing anti-Semitic persecution in Europe and the Middle East. The situation reveals a central tension for Israel, which has both a particular obligation to protect Jews and, some say, a general responsibility to represent Jewish values to the world. Some Israeli rabbis launched a campaign to protect African asylum seekers facing forced expulsion. However, the Israeli leader, Benjamin Netanyahu, has called the migrants illegal infiltrators and claimed their presence was a threat to Israel's social fabric and Jewish character. So the lines are drawn, with large numbers of Israeli doctors, pilots, retired diplomats, professors, rabbis, architects, and musicians signing petitions, arguing a nation formed by refugees after the Holocaust has a special obligation to treat refugees with more compassion.
Does Israel, whose British embassy is here in central London, have a moral obligation to shelter African refugees? And does Israel have a problem with racism? Simple questions with important answers. Let's remember, Israel itself was created by refugees and European immigrants. Yet the leader, Benjamin Netanyahu, describes the African refugees as illegal infiltrators. What are the public's thoughts here in Britain on what some regard as a hypocritical position with regard to these people?
Maybe there is, as a point of how it was built. I'm Jewish, but I don't have a strong opinion on that. But I would say it's a bit controversial, yeah.
Absolutely. I think, especially for a religion that's supposed to be inclusive and bringing people together under one faith and one idea, that to sort of fracture that by certain people being valid and others being invalid, I think is totally unfair.
Quite possibly, because there's a lot of Jews in Israel itself, so I mean, Jews are kind of almost one of a kind, so to not let the African Jews in is a bit hypocrisy, really, a bit weird.
Total hypocrisy, but then, you know, often there's one rule for one and one rule for another, and they've obviously done the same thing, and they've forgotten their roots.
There's just a very long and turbulent history, and it's a very difficult situation to kind of judge externally. I mean, imagine growing up in that situation.
Well, it's a religion, isn't it? I mean, if you're part of a religion, you should be accepted anywhere.
Do you think they have a moral obligation to accept the African Jews?
They have to any Jew from any part of the world.
I do. I think unfortunately, most countries have a full of contradictions, and Israel's no exception.
So do you think it is a contradiction to bar?
Yes.
How does it make you feel?
Frustrating, but not surprised.
Well, it's clear that Israel itself could be considered an illegal infiltrator, certainly on the West Bank, Gaza, where they've robbed the land of the Palestinians for decades and introduced apartheid-like laws to oppress that population. So it's woeful hypocrisy from Netanyahu to consider African migrants to be anything other than a useful contribution and effective economic migrants to the country. Israel is a land that is built on immigration. And as such, I would have thought that they would have a wholly progressive attitude, but it seems as though Israel considers itself to be wholly a white man's country, and in essence is exacting a deportation regime that is saying non-white Jews or Arabs will be removed from this country. And I think that is complete hypocrisy.
The word infiltrators has a history in Israel. It's used to describe those people who were ejected from Palestine in 1948, and anyone who tried to come back across the new boundaries of the State of Israel were called infiltrators. And there was a free fire policy operating, so anyone who was an infiltrator was liable to be shot. So you have to understand they're using the word infiltrator, which has a history there. They have an inventive use of language, so that, for example, they have something called the present absentees. These are people who are there but not there. These are Palestinians who were displaced internally. They're still in Israel. Sometimes they just camped outside the village where they used to live in, which has either been razed to the ground or had a forest planted over it or had a settlement built over it. And these people are present absentees. They're there and they're not there, and their property elsewhere may be confiscated quite legally. So there is a combination of legalism and inventive language. And this, I think, constitutes a hypocrisy. They're trying to ignore and to prolong and intensify suffering by pretending that it doesn't exist.
Critics say that Israel is under a moral obligation to shelter the Africans, considering the fate of Jewish refugees who were turned away from Western countries after World War II. Does the public agree, and why?
I think they did. I don't know if it's changing now. Maybe it's overflowing a bit as well, as in England there's an issue. But I know as a fact, I'm Russian Jew, and a lot of Russian Jews were still accepted, so that's not in a lot of other countries. So I'm quite, I would agree that they should, but they did, and I don't know what's happening now in terms of African Jews. So.
Yeah, I would agree with that totally. I think, like I just said, I think, if you're united under one sort of flag and faith, then I don't understand why that's a problem.
Well, I think they should welcome them as well.
From any continent?
From any continent, yes.
Yeah, I agree. That's why I still thought it was like that. It's kind of a shock to me that they're refusing African Jews, because Jewish are Jewish, aren't they? Really, it doesn't matter where you're from or which continent you're from.
That's just a general human rights issue. I think that all countries have a moral obligation to help people who are in need, who have been persecuted. So I think, notwithstanding any historical issues, I think just moving forward, in general, just humanity has that obligation.
Well, any country has a moral obligation to look after the people that come into its country. And Israel, as I said, Israel's no exception. And you'd think they'd learn from the past that, persecuting people is not something that's very, very pleasant or desirable. And it's not something that should be carried out by a civilized society.
Let me tell you that Israel as a state has a moral obligation to the world. The world saved the Jewish community after the horrific nightmare of the Third Reich and Hitler's Nazism. And so our hopes are invested in the Jewish community, that they of all people, suffering as they did the most industrial horrors ever seen, that they would have an open heart, a progressive attitude, and a compassionate approach to tackling refugees and asylum seekers. Of course, Israel has a moral obligation to help African immigrants, because Israel itself was the beneficiary of that same global compassion from people right around the world after the horrors that they suffered at the hands of Hitler. So my vote is with all of those who say that Israel, from its history, should know better.
Yes, well, in 1951 there was an international refugee convention about the way in which refugees should be treated. Israel was among the first signatories. Quite naturally, it was a country founded on refugees. They were arguing all the time for refugees to be allowed to come to Israel. And this this convention puts obligations on states to treat refugees properly and gives refugees rights. And Israel has been simply, in this case, trying to buy out that moral obligation. There's another issue, which is that among the convention rights is the right not to be detained. No state may arbitrarily detain refugees. Israel has built a massive detention center in Haaretz in the Negev just for these African asylum seekers. They have a choice. They can agree to be deported to a country in Africa which isn't their own, or they can rot in the detention center indefinitely. I mean, that's a sick alternative that's being offered.
Israel has been and is still receiving aid and support from countries worldwide. Yet it has granted asylum to less than 1% of those who have applied. Does the public feel Israel receives more than it gives back to the international community?
I think it's doing badly for the international community now. I think the Palestinian problem is an apartheid, basically. And its approach to the occupied territories is indefensible.
Maybe. But also there's an element of people who come taking their jobs and more qualified, and Israelis losing their jobs or not being able to get those jobs. So there's that as well. Within the country, there's that conflict as well.
I suppose so. I'm trying to think what they do give back to the international community apart from a sort of controversial rhetoric all the time. So yeah, I'd probably have to agree with that, yeah.
I still think they should take anyone that is Jewish, yes.
I think it is difficult because I am not xenophobic, but then equally they don't support us in our Christian beliefs and stuff like that. So if they're going to preach to other people about them having particular beliefs and being so confined, then why should we help them when they don't give anything back?
I don't know, to be honest. It's a lot of this is quite secretive, isn't it? It's done between governments on a handshake, and you know, I scratch you scratch my back, I scratch your back. So it's sometimes difficult to know. But I suspect America's given quite a significant amount of aid to Israel, which is not actually well publicised. Probably more so than they give to the Palestinians.
I think Israel as a nation on the world has benefited enormously from the compassion, the empathy, the support for all peoples who saw the Jewish community suffer as they did in the Second World War and wanted to ensure that at least the world could have a peaceful Jewish nation. And in doing so, we have pumped billions of international aid into Israel. They've chosen to use that money to do two things ostensibly: weaponize their military so that they can go on offensive against the Palestinian communities. Their colonial settlerism has robbed their land of the West Bank, and also to ensure that they can enforce an apartheid-like rule society. South Africa today says Israel is the only apartheid nation left on the face of the planet. And I think the international aid we give them is funding that discrimination, that prejudice, that racism, and the denial of Palestinian human rights.
If that 1% sounds abstract, but it's people, and the total number of people that Israel has accepted as refugees since its foundation is 11. Canada, by contrast, dealing with very large numbers of migrants, has reached figures as high as 97% of acceptance. This is an extraordinary deliberate decision by Israel to discourage the arrival of people that it doesn't want. It has a record of breaking or defying and ignoring international law. So the International Criminal Court, no, the International Court of Justice in 2004 ruled that Israel's wall that it was building to separate off the West Bank from the rest of the country was illegal. Nothing's happened. Israel hasn't fallen in line. No country outside puts pressure on Israel to do what it ought to do. And yet if you look at other countries that are breaking the law, Russia occupied the Ukraine 2 or 3 years back and is under quite strong sanctions. Israel has been occupying the West Bank for 50 years, and instead it gets $3 billion a year of international military aid, particularly from the United States. So Israel takes, but it doesn't give. It's not entirely surprising that under these circumstances, Israel is one of the least well-regarded countries internationally. There are surveys of public opinion done by the BBC every year, and Israel is always in the bottom 4 for its impact on the international world. The other 3 that Israel cohabits with are Zimbabwe, Pakistan, North Korea. Israel's down there because it takes from the international community, but it never gives back.
Let's look at the numbers. About 20,000 refugees have already been expelled, according to the Israeli government. 60,000 immigrants fleeing persecution, nearly all from Eritrea and Sudan, crossed Israel's border with Egypt before the government erected a fence along the desert frontier. Yet the proportion of immigrants is relatively small compared to, say, Germany, which accepted 722,400 asylum applications in 2016 alone. That's nearly 1% of the entire German population.
Commentators have suggested that there is an element of racism in the treatment of these African asylum seekers. Is racism a problem in Israel? We asked the public.
I don't think so. But at the same time, it's a very sensitive question, I think, for Israeli Jews, because, again, they think that, like Russian Jews, they call them Russians, they don't call them Jews. So there might be an element of underlying, I don't want to say anything, but there's a point in there.
Well, there probably is, and that's a shame as well, I think so.
It's definitely a possibility, because there's no reason why they would refuse the Africans. I mean, I know they don't originate from Israel, but I don't see why they wouldn't allow them into Israel. I don't see what the problem is. So racism is a possibility.
African Jews have got nothing to offer. They're less, if you like, less superior than the Jews have come from Europe, and it's quite sad actually that they feel that way.
I think racism in Israel is a huge problem, and let me tell you why. I think the world looks at the Israeli community as a special community, as a people who've suffered horrendous, murderous genocide. And as such, there's an expectation that the Israeli would grow with a progressive mind, with an open mind, with a commitment to equality of justice given their experience. But there's a very famous saying by a philosopher, and it says, when you look into the abyss looks into you. And I think what we've seen is the horrific trauma of violence perpetrated on the Jewish community has been ingested into their psychology. They're now perpetrating that violence on the Palestinian community and African refugees. Israeli people are a people who should know better, whose history should have taught them to be peaceful and to be accommodating. And instead, we have an Israel that is infected with the very racism that they themselves were victims of.
I'm sorry to say that racism does in fact permeate Israel's society. They have an articulated hierarchy of races with Ashkenazi Jews at the top, other white people, the Mizrahi Jews who are brown-skinned, there's the Palestinians, there's now the Africans, and there's the treatment gets worse and worse as you get lower down the rungs of this ladder. Miri Regev, who is, believe it or not, the Minister of Culture there, has described the Africans as a cancer in Israeli society. That might sound racist to you, but then she apologized to cancer sufferers for comparing them with Africans. There's the aim of the deportation, I think, is curiously, given the origins with Nazi extermination, a feeling of the necessity of racial purity, of maintaining Jewish superiority. 48% of the Jewish population now wishes to expel all Palestinians. 75% says they don't want to live next door to a Palestinian. South Africa describes in the United Nations evidence, describes Israel as the one remaining apartheid state in the world.
Many African refugees fled persecution to seek asylum in Israel. Yet Israel wants to send them back to West Africa again, even though some refugees said they would rather spend the rest of their lives in prison. What does the public think of that?
Yeah, I think they should be allowed. They should be allowed.
Oh, it's horrible, isn't it? I mean, what a dire situation to find yourself in. I think it's heartbreaking that in the 21st century we're still those are the options, and those are the that decision has to be preferable to. It's horrible. It's horrible.
Well, there's reasons for that, isn't there? I mean, Africa's not really safe at the moment, and they obviously feel more protected in another country, especially Israel.
Tragic. I mean, I can't believe, but unfortunately that is the state of the world today. I'm sure that if you took that argument across Syria, they'd probably rather be in prison over here than they would be in their own country, because they're not going to get blown up in prison.
I would say they know their country better than, so I can't make a comment. So obviously they rather be treated as second-class or third-class citizen than to be probably tortured in their own place.
I think it's absolutely disgusting. I think it's terrible. Interestingly, there's very little publicity on the TV about it. There seems to be more concerns about the friction between the Palestinians and Israeli, which is obviously a major problem.
I think that the decision by Israel to put a bounty on the heads of African migrants to sell them to any country that will take them for $3,500 is a massive abrogation of their commitment to human rights and freedom for refugees escaping war, terror, famine and torture. We see that the Israeli government is very prepared to prostitute itself by adding this bounty on the heads of black Jewish people to rid themselves of their own people. By definition, they are Jewish by blood, and yet because their skin color is not white, they are willing to sell them off like slaves to any African country that will take them. And I think African countries have got to ask themselves the ethical question, is this right?
It's a very sad statement. These are people who in many cases have been trafficked across the frontier. Many of them have been the subject of violence or even of torture. They are an understandable fear of being not returned to their own countries. Israel hasn't done that. Returning them to another country in which they have no relatives, they have no stake, they don't speak the language, and they are understandably terrified of what could happen to them there. Israel itself has said that they will have no way of tracking what happens to them after they are sent to Rwanda or Uganda or wherever it might be. They are internationally recognized as refugees. There are standards of treatment for that which are being ignored. Israel is trying to buy its way out of its moral obligation. And if this happened in our society or in our family, that we would say, we have a moral obligation to that person, but actually that would just give some money and somebody else look after them, we would say that was immoral, and I think it is. It's deeply saddening, particularly in the light of the foundation story of Israel itself, which was born out of, to a very considerable extent, out of suffering and out of terrible experiences, and they are now putting other people in the same way.
Tel Aviv describes the African migrants who entered Israel illegally from neighbouring Egypt as infiltrators. But some have lived for years in Israel, with many working in low-income jobs which many Israelis won't do. The country has granted asylum to fewer than 1% of those applying and has a years-long backlog of applicants.
The Israeli government has threatened mass deportations of African migrants for years. Now they're offering those migrants a stark choice: a plane ticket out or life in prison. In reality, the choice for many is persecution abroad or incarceration in Israel. Confronted with this grim dilemma, many terrified refugees would rather choose prison. As refugees face this choice between evils, Israel, given its own history, faces the charge of hypocrisy.